Before we start, just a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. Only 2% are subscribed. At 1,000 subscribers, I'll be posting a special video. The fork scraped and I bit hard. Spice flooded my tongue and a sharp anise bite followed. Pain jabbed low like a switch flipped under my skin. I looked up and Jules froze with her hand on the fridge. I knew then this wasn't heartburn. I'm Mara, 29, and I was 14 weeks. I chewed again because hunger had ruled my mornings. A metallic tang rose and my mouth went cold. Jules shut the fridge with careful fingers and a thin smile. My stomach tightened like it wanted out. Is it good? She leaned on the counter and watched. Too spicy. I tried a laugh that didn't land. A drop of sweat slid and the room seemed nearer. I tasted something medicinal and panic nudged my throat. I set the plate down and my hands shook. Another cramp hit and my knees dipped. Jules grabbed a paper cup and filled it halfway. Drink. She pushed it closer and didn't meet my eyes. I sipped once and the tang sharpened like a warning. I pulled my phone because the fear got loud. Pick up. I called Dan and counted rings. He answered with typing noises and a patient tone. I need you here now. I kept my voice level. I'm cramping bad and something tastes wrong. Silence stretched and my vision pulsed. Call the doctor first. His breath stalled then smoothed. I will head over. Keys clacked in the background. I pressed my palm under my ribs and nodded to no one. Okay. I ended the call because another wave rose. Jules glanced at the door like she expected company. I walked to the bathroom and locked the door. A smear of red where there should be nothing. The air left my chest in one ugly sound. I braced on the sink and tried to breathe steady. The next drip hit tile like a clock. I sat and counted to 30, then 40. A cold film moved over my skin and stayed. I whispered stay to the small life inside me. I knew whispering did nothing, and I whispered anyway. I looked at my shoes and fought the urge to scream. The taste clung, sweet then bitter like a trick. I spat into tissue and looked for color. Just spit, no answers, no relief, only dread. I washed my mouth and it came right back. I decided to leave before I fainted. I opened the door and nearly bumped Jules. Do you want me to drive? Her voice kept even. No. I grabbed my bag and pressed it to my belly. I'm going to the hospital now. She stepped aside and studied the floor. The hallway stretched and every step felt slow. My breath stuttered and I blinked, the edges clear. Someone laughed near accounting and the sound cut deep. I pressed elevator down and watched the numbers crawl. I took the stairs because waiting felt dangerous. Outside I gulped air and focused on the curb. A rideshare pulled up and I waved it off. I needed movement without strangers and questions. I started the car and gripped the wheel too hard. The key slipped and my knuckle split. I drove because stopping would shatter me. Every bump sent a warning through my core. I kept talking to the empty seat and the dashboard. Hold on, 2 minutes, red light, turn now. The hospital sign rose and my vision tunneled. I parked crooked and left the door open. Triage took one look and rolled me inside. Questions fired and I answered in clipped bursts. Pepper at lunch, strange taste, cramping that won't quit. The nurse's mouth tightened like she heard a pattern. Blood pressure cuff squeezed and numbers flashed. She swabbed my mouth and bagged the tissue quickly. Any drugs or drinks today? Calm voice, sharp eyes. No. I swallowed and the anise bite returned. She wrote something and waved for a wheelchair. The tech pushed me down a narrow hall. Fluorescent hum grew and my thoughts scattered. Baby still moving, the words came out like a plea. We will check right now. His jaw worked once. The door slid open and the gel bottle waited. Gown, table, screen, cold gel and a wand. I stared at the ceiling and counted my breaths again. The tech watched the monitor and adjusted angles. I hunted for a flutter that always calmed me. Silence pressed until my ears rang. He shifted left and my chest forgot air. I kept my face blank because breaking would break me. He moved right and the silence hardened. My hands dug into the thin blanket and held on. A door clicked and someone stepped in. Deep breath, a doctor with careful hands stood close. The wand paused and then glided in one slow arc. He watched the screen and his lashes didn't move. I stared at him instead of the black field. He nodded once and my heart hit bone. We need labs now, he spoke to the nurse. Start fluids and get toxicology. My eyes snapped to him and the room tilted. Toxicology meant poison and poison meant a choice. I felt the choice land like a verdict. I licked my lips and tasted that fake sweetness. I thought of the break room in a careful smile. I thought of the fridge door closing with quiet intent. Fear shifted into something steadier and colder. I decided to tell Th.M. everything I had noticed. Strange flavor after 2 bites, my voice rasped. Like licorice candy mixed with chemicals. The nurse met my eyes and didn't look away. Who served the food? Her pen hovered and waited. I pictured the hand that nudged the plate. Coworker named Jules. I kept my tone flat. She was there and watched me eat. The doctor traded a glance with the nurse and nodded. We will test for specific agents. I gripped the rail and braced for the next hit. The nurse slid a needle and the bag filled. I watched the red line and clung to the rhythm. The monitor beeped and my pulse steadied a fraction. If they found anything, it would be in time. If they didn't, I would find it myself. My phone buzzed on the tray and lit up. Dan asked for updates and an ETA and calm. I typed bleeding and tests and possible contamination. 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. I locked the screen because doubt can spread fast. Another cramp rose and broke across me. I bit the inside of my cheek and counted backward. The tech adjusted the screen and avoided my gaze. The doctor's jaw set and the room held steady. Something important was about to be spoken. Stop the scan. The doctor lifted the probe and exhaled once. His eyes moved to mine and held there without blinking. No cardiac activity. The room tilted as the words landed. A nurse steadied the table and reached for the call button. I stared at the screen anyway, waiting for a flicker that never came. Draw blood now. The command cut through my fog. A tray appeared and a tourniquet pinched my arm tight. I watched the tube fill and felt the floor drift away. They labeled vials while I counted inward to keep from falling. Toxicology meant proof or nothing, and nothing terrified me. Any other symptoms? The nurse's pen hovered over the form. Numb mouth and sudden cramps and heavy flow. She nodded once and circled items like it mattered. Did anyone prepare your lunch or bring you anything? I pictured a careful smile and a hand that hovered too long. Someone handed me that plate. My voice shook then steadied. Coworker. I swallowed hard and kept her name for later. The nurse wrote slowly and watched my face for cracks. We will run a panel for agents that match your description. I clenched the sheet because description sounded flimsy against loss. Footsteps. The curtain shifted and a counselor stepped in. She took a chair and folded both hands without touching me. We can sit in silence if you want. I wanted sirens instead of silence and action instead of comfort. Run the tests first, I answered because comfort could wait. My phone buzzed again on the tray like a tiny alarm. I read the message and felt my jaw lock. Updates, then another ping, any sign of movement. I typed back no heartbeat, waiting on labs. The typing dots blinked then vanished, which told its own story. An orderly rolled me toward another bay for observation. I fixed on the clock and tracked each minute like a target. The IV cooled my arm and set a slow rhythm. My brain flipped through every frame of lunch and hallway. There was intention at that table, and I would prove it. A resident arrived with gloves already on. We are sending your blood and the tissue you brought. He paused at my mouth like he sensed the residue. Any strange aftertaste right now? Yes, I said, like fake sweetness that won't leave, and he nodded. They swabbed my tongue and sealed the swab fast. Turn your head. The motion made my vision spark. He wrote orders and left with the samples under his arm. The door closed and I heard the latch click twice. Procedure felt like progress, which kept me breathing. A chaplain stepped in with soft shoes and kinder eyes. I can wait outside, he offered, already backing away. I nodded because words would have broken me open. He rested a hand near the foot of the bed, then withdrew. Kindness burned when I needed anger more. The nurse returned with a new bag and a tighter line. Fluids for now, we monitor and keep you stable. I asked for the head nurse and legal forms for reports. Her brows rose, then she brought them without delay. I wrote every detail I could trust while it still felt sharp. Describe the flavor precisely. Her tone stayed measured and direct. Like sweet herbs and dentist swab and penny dust. She wrote that down and underlined it twice. Any witness to your eating that meal? Yes, I breathed out. She watched the whole time and her jaw clenched. The doctor returned with a clipped update. Lab rush is in progress and we flagged possible adulterants. He placed a contact card under my palm and tapped it once. If results match certain compounds, we notify law enforcement immediately. I closed my fingers over the card like it might run. I asked for a copy of everything, every order and time stamp. He agreed and told the nurse to print and log. Per slid onto a clipboard near my hand like a small shield. I scanned entries and traced the minute I arrived. A timeline forms a spine and mine needed steel. A porter wheeled me for a second scan without words. Another tech tried angles my body didn't want to endure. We both watched that stubborn stillness and neither looked away. He swallowed once and tucked the probe into its cradle. Back to observation, he managed, and my throat went dry. In the bay, a social worker waited with steady posture. We can help you file a workplace incident report today. Do it, I answered because hesitation had already cost me. She opened a tablet and turned it for my signature. Each digital line felt like a step toward a fight I wanted. The curtain opened again and Dan stepped in fast. He kissed my forehead and searched my face for hope. There's still a chance, right? His voice strained and hung. I looked at him and watched the belief drain. He glanced at the monitor like it could disagree. Tests are running, I told him, and he rubbed his jaw. Maybe stress did this. His gaze slid to the floor. I held the card the doctor left and kept my mouth shut. If I spoke too soon, I would drown him in rage. He checked his watch and I turned my head away. Who gave you the food? He softened his tone and waited. A colleague. I kept it flat because certainty had edges. You think someone tried to harm you? His eyes flickered. I think someone wanted me to lose this child. He flinched like the words struck him, and still he doubted. A nurse stepped between us with a printout and relief. Initial screen shows atropine trace. She kept her voice even. My breath hitched and my fingers dug into the blanket. She pointed to a line that might as well have shouted. Full panel pending, she added, and I caught Dan staring. He reached for the page like it might correct itself. His lips parted, then closed and opened again. It could be contamination, he tried, weak as paper. The nurse folded the report and tucked it into my chart. We handle chain of custody tightly, she reminded, and left us. I pressed the call button and asked for security. The officer arrived with a small pad and a crisp stare. I issued a formal statement and gave a single name. My voice didn't shake the second time I said it. The officer wrote it down and asked for the company address. He requested permission to hold my clothing for analysis. Yes, I answered, already peeling the fabric with shaking hands. He sealed everything in view and logged each piece. Do you feel safe returning home tonight? He paused at the doorway. I feel focused, I said, which wasn't safety but would do. When he left, I pulled the blanket to my collarbone. I watched him pace 2 steps and stop and stare. He touched the chair, then stepped back like it burned. We should wait for final results before blaming anyone. We aren't blaming, I said, we are naming, and his breath caught. The doctor came back with eyes that avoided comfort. Official confirmation in an hour, he said, and checked the IV. We are notifying the on-call investigator once the panel completes. He placed a number on the tray and tapped it twice. Call if you feel unsafe at any point, and he was gone. I looked at the door and thought of a break room. I thought of a hand that hovered just a little too long. I thought of a vial I hadn't seen but could prove. Anger climbed into the space grief had hollowed out. I was not done, and whoever did this would learn that fast. The lab runner arrived at a trot and slid a folder over. The doctor opened it and his mouth went thin. Atropine confirmed, trace opioid also present. My spine locked while the nurse adjusted the drip. I turned to the door because the next move mattered. Notify security and law enforcement, the doctor ordered, one breath. He pressed a number into my hand and met my eyes. Use it if anyone pressures you to leave. I nodded and watched the nurse log the time twice. Verification calmed me and enraged me at once. Dan was already pacing when the officer stepped in. Badge notebook, calm voice like a metronome. Who provided the meal and who had access? Coworker, I answered, and my hands stopped trembling. He asked for the company address and a contact with keys. He photographed my clothes and sealed them under my gaze. Any leftovers of the same dish at work? Yes, I said, in the shared refrigerator, and his pen paused. Preservation request goes out now, he dialed without leaving. I closed my eyes because a clock had finally started. Dan reached for the folder, then pulled back. This could be a false positive, he tried for steady. I watched his throat work and waited for the next excuse. Or cross-contamination from the hospital, he pushed on. The nurse lifted one brow and wrote in silence. False positives do not align with clinical findings, the doctor said. Your P. Artner presented with symptoms consistent with exposure. Dan swallowed and stared at the monitor like it would help. He rubbed his forehead and whispered something that never finished. Doubt sat between us like a barrier I could not move. I signed the complaint form and requested immediate evidence hold. The officer listed steps and I memorized every verb. Contact building security and IT for footage, I added. He glanced up and nodded once, surprised I was ahead. Grief had become precision and I leaned into it. My phone lit again with a message from a known number. Your mother wants to come by. I stared at the words until my jaw ached. Not here, I typed not today and hit send. A smaller storm gathered and I let it gather. The social worker returned with a workplace incident packet. We can transmit this now to your HR lead. Do it, I answered and pointed to the time field. Mark the lunch hour exact, I insisted, and she did. Timing would force doors open that people like to lock. The officer asked for permission to mirror my phone. Only messages from today, I said, and he agreed. He paired the device and captured the crucial thread. Do not delete anything until further notice. My thumb hovered over trash and then curled into my palm. Dan stepped closer, slower, hands up like I was volatile. You're hurting and reaching for enemies, he murmured. I studied him and heard loyalty fighting with comfort. You want a villain because it feels better than chance. I let the silence speak for me because he had not listened. The nurse returned with release instructions and a stern look. Report filed and results forwarded to the investigator. Do you have a safe place for tonight? Yes, I said, our home, and watched Dan flinch. Safety had just become a test I would grade alone. Escort available if requested, the officer offered at the curtain. Walk me to the car, I said, and he nodded. Dan gathered nothing because there was nothing to gather. He followed 2 steps behind like he had been demoted. The hallway felt longer than it had in the morning. Outside, air hit my face and the world sharpened. The officer scanned the lot and kept pace beside me. Expect contact from a detective within 24 hours. I will not wait to secure the footage, I replied. He smiled without warmth and said that would help them. In the car, Dan gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Tell me you are not accusing family, he pleaded. I watched his hands and thought about patterns. Right now I am accusing actions, not surnames. He stared through the windshield and chose to misunderstand. I called the office and asked for facilities. Do not clear the kitchen or throw out anything. The manager started to protest and I cut him off. Police directive on an active case, I added, and he yielded. I ended the call and felt a small piece slide into place. Another vibration, a message from Jules this time. How are you? No punctuation, too quick. I stared at the screen and watched the typing bubble. Can we talk privately? Appeared and then vanished. My heartbeat tripped because the hunt was suddenly moving. Drive to our place, I said, eyes still on the phone. Dan merged and kept silent, jaw clenched against reality. I typed a reply with deliberate brevity. Tomorrow morning, cafe near the office, no one else. 3 dots blinked again, then okay, and a second hook appeared. I opened a new note and listed what mattered now. Who handled the meal, who hovered nearby, who benefits. Every question earned an action beside it like a task. Evidence would shore up the truth I already felt. Someone close had crossed a line I could not forgive. We pulled into our street and he killed the engine. Please do not make this bigger than it is. It is already bigger than us, I answered without raising my voice. He closed his eyes like that might roll time backward. I opened the door because nothing good comes from staying put. On the porch, my phone chimed again with an unknown alert. A cloud backup completed for the office camera system. I breathed out once and let relief cool my rage. Tomorrow I would watch you touch my lunch at 11. Tonight I would lock the door and sleep with my plan loaded. I woke before the alarm and opened the laptop fast. The camera portal loaded and asked for a code I barely remembered. I typed it twice and the dashboard snapped into view. Kitchen feed yesterday, 1100 hours. My hand hovered above the trackpad like I might trigger a bomb. Play, the timeline crawled and the doorway stayed empty. A blur crossed the frame and blocked the angle. A box got set on the counter and pushed aside. Jules walked in and checked the haul with a quick tilt. She lifted my container and peeled the lid like a thief. She reached into her tote and palmed something tiny. She sprinkled, stirred, then wiped the rim with a napkin. Her face tightened when footsteps passed the hall. She shoved the napkin deep into the tote and smiled. The video clock recorded every twitch and every choice. Another figure appeared at the edge and paused. Only an arm and a wrist with a distinctive bracelet. The forearm leaned in and a whisper bent the air. Jules nodded and put the container back exactly. My stomach turned because I recognized that bracelet from dinners. The doorbell rang and I flinched hard. Dan called through the door and used the house key. He saw the laptop light and stopped in the hallway. "What are you watching?" He stepped closer slowly. "Evidence," I answered and pressed rewind to the whisper. He leaned over my shoulder and breathed through his nose. "That could be anyone," he muttered, eyes on the bracelet. "Not anyone," I said, and the footage kept looping. He straightened and rubbed his face like he could scrub memory. "You cannot go there," he warned, which told me everything. I clipped the segment and exported a clean file. Then another clip of the sprinkle and the napkin. I opened a blank email to the investigator on call. Subject line simple and hard like a stone. I attached the clips and added exact timestamps. Phone buzzed, message from Jules. "Can we make it earlier?" showed on the screen. 8 I wrote same place and watched for a reply. "Okay," pinged back with a second later confirmation. Setting the meeting earlier felt like pulling a pin. I printed stills and tucked them into a folder. My hand stopped shaking once the paper felt real. I placed the folder into my bag and zipped it closed. The zipper's rasp steadied me more than words could. I planned my questions and none of them were polite. We drove in silence and parked 2 blocks away. I wanted an exit and a view of the door. He reached for my hand and I let him hold air. "Please," he tried, and his eyes searched for a version he preferred. I stepped out and walked because pity had no seat here. The cafe opened to early commuters and quiet trades. I picked a table near the wall and faced the entrance. Jules arrived with damp hair and restless hands. She dropped into the chair and stared at the floor. "Tell me why you're early," I started, and she blinked hard. "I couldn't sleep." She twisted her sleeve and glanced at the window. "You watch the feeds," I said, and she froze. I slid a still frame across the table without ceremony. Her breath hitched and her mouth worked without sound. "Who was at the doorway?" I asked, and she closed her eyes. "Do not make me say it," she whispered toward the table. "You will say it," I answered and kept my voice steady. She reached for the photo and pulled back like it burned. "If I say it, there's no going back." "There was never a back," I said, and she folded. She leaned in until our heads nearly touched. "I owed money and I was promised help," she breathed. "From who?" I pressed, and my nails dug into my palm. She swallowed and moved her lips around a name she didn't release. "Bracelet," she managed, and I let the silence chew it. A stroller bumped my chair and I caught my breath. Jules flinched and stared at my hands instead of my face. "I thought it would just make you sick," she whispered. My jaw clicked and the world narrowed to her fingerprints. "Not sick," I answered, "empty," and she crumpled in place. "You can fix this now," I said, and she looked up. "Text the person from last night and ask to meet." She unlocked her phone and hovered over the keyboard. "What do I write?" she asked, voice almost gone. "Say the footage is safe with someone else," I told her. She typed slowly while I watched her thumbs tremble. A message went out and the clock started for real. We waited 3 long breaths that felt like sparks. The reply arrived with 2 words that stripped the air. "Not here," it read, followed by a nearby address. I captured the screen with my own phone. I sent the screenshot to the investigator without delay. Setting a meeting, I typed, requesting surveillance. Acknowledgement flashed back with a promise to station support. I pocketed the phone and studied Jules again. You will walk with me and you will not run. She nodded and wiped her face with the back of her hand. If you bolt, I give them everything right now, I added. Her shoulders sagged under a weight she built herself. I will walk, she said, and I believed her for once. We exited to the street and crossed at the light. The address pointed to a narrow storefront with tinted glass. I kept us across the road and waited near a delivery truck. A woman stepped from a rideshare and adjusted her sleeve. The same bracelet flashed and caught in my throat. Jules stopped moving like her legs forgot the plan. She gripped my arm and started to shake. Do we go? She asked, already knowing the answer. We watched, I said, and we let them arrive. A dark sedan eased to the curb and didn't turn off. Two plainclothes stepped out in split directions. One took the corner and the other drifted near the entrance. The sedan rolled away and left space for a clean approach. Jules turned even paler and squeezed my elbow hard. Last chance to stand on the right side, I murmured. The bracelet lifted a phone and scanned the block. A head turned toward the cafe we had left. I looked down and drifted behind a column and waited. My pulse slowed because the next moment would define everything. When the officer touched his earpiece, I knew we were up. The plainclothes officer lifted a hand and the street slowed. Jules squeezed my arm and stared at the bracelet across the road. The woman checked her reflection in the glass and waited. I breathed once and nodded toward the storefront. We moved when the officer moved. Walk to the do. Or I told Jules without looking at her. She swallowed and matched my pace like we rehearsed. Across traffic, the bracelet tilted, then turned our way. I felt the old life crack under my shoes. One step more and everything would be said out loud. The officer brushed past me and tapped his earpiece twice. A second agent angled left and cut off the side exit. The woman noticed the drift and lifted her chin. Jules faltered and I steadied her wrist with mine. Keep going, I whispered, and she kept going. We reached the awning and stopped under its edge. The bracelet woman looked straight through me like I was glass. Alone, she snapped, flicking two fingers toward Jules. Not alone, I answered, and the agent pivoted into view. Her mouth tightened because control was leaving the room. Inside, the officer said, opening the door with his shoulder. We entered a quiet space that smelled like solvents. A clerk began to speak and then went silent. Badges appeared and the room learned new rules. I stood near the wall and refused to blink. Phone on the counter, the agent told the bracelet woman. She placed it down with two careful taps. Passcode, he asked, pen ready for the digits. She stared at me instead of the keypad. Now, he added, and her fingers obeyed. Jules pulled a napkin from her pocket and trembled. She unfolded it and set it next to the phone. A fine dust marked the paper like proof. The agent bagged it and sealed the bag fast. The woman's nostrils flared and her eyes went cold. Who gave you that? The officer asked Jules first. She looked at the bracelet, then at the floor. From her yesterday, she whispered, voice scraping the tile. The woman scoffed and crossed her arms sharply. Confidence leaked from her like a slow puncture. I took out the still frames and laid them flat. Sprinkle, wipe, return, a whisper at the threshold. The bracelet in the corner of the frame glinted. The woman's jaw locked, then relaxed a fraction. Denial had fewer places to hide now. Where is the rest? The agent asked evenly. A blink, then a glance toward the back room. The second officer followed the glance without comment. Drawers opened and something clinked into a pouch. The clerk began to shake like a leaf under a boot. Chain of custody forms, I said to no one in particular. The lead agent slid them toward me without looking up. I signed where he tapped and kept my lines straight. My hand steadied because action cleared the fog. The woman watched me like I had built the trap. Why are you doing this? I asked, voice low and steady. She smiled without warmth and lifted her chin again. You were never right for him, she murmured. The words landed and burned the last bridge. Jules covered her mouth and stared at the floorboards. The agent turned the phone so the screen faced her. Messages with the coworker, he said, opening the thread. A name lit up with timestamps that matched my calendar. He scrolled to a photo of a tiny glass vial. Her mouth pressed thin, then thinner, then nothing. Would you like counsel present? He asked, still neutral. She arched an eyebrow as if the room bored her. Am I under arrest? She asked, eyes on me. Detained during execution of a warrant, he replied. She exhaled through her nose and glanced at the door. The back officer returned with a labeled box. He held it up without flourish and read the sticker. My stomach dropped and then settled into granite. The agent opened it and counted 3 vials aloud. Documentation mattered because truth needs edges. Jules shifted closer to me like distance could still protect. "Tell him," I said, tilting my head toward the woman. "Tell your son what you did this week." Her fingers twitched and the bracelet clicked against her wrist. "I protected a future," she whispered, barely moving her mouth. The agent paused with his pen midair and looked to me. "You mentioned threats before the incident," he prompted. I nodded and unlocked my phone with a firm tap. Screenshots glowed with warnings about responsibility and timing. He mirrored them and logged the times with a neat stroke. A door opened in the hallway and a detective entered. He took in the tableau and nodded once to his team. "Transport ready," he said, voice flat as concrete. The agent cuffed the woman with clean, efficient hands. Her bracelet slid under the cuff and bit her skin. She turned her head toward me as they guided her. "You will regret this," she breathed, eyes hot and fixed. I didn't answer because threats belonged to the past now. Instead, I raised my camera and captured her leaving. The shutter popped and sealed the moment like a stamp. Jules sagged into a chair and dug nails into her palm. "I will give everything," she whispered toward the counter. "Names transfers the first meeting." The detective rested a card by her elbow. "Then you start today," he said, and she nodded hard. The clerk lifted Ken hands and asked to call his manager. The detective agreed and moved him to the side. The lead agent packed the vials into a rigid case. He secured the latch and wrote one more line on the form. The case left the counter like it carried a pulse. Outside, the sedan waited with the rear door open. The woman paused on the threshold and looked up. Dan stood across the street with his phone half raised. His face broke and then rearranged into something hard. He lowered the phone and failed to move. I crossed to him and stopped at arm's length. He searched my eyes for a softer script. "You saw it," I said, and he swallowed twice. "She would never," he whispered, even while watching it happen. I let the silence answer because hope had already lied. The detective approached us and kept his tone even. "We will need your statements this afternoon." Dan rubbed his chest and nodded without focus. I said yes and asked for a copy of the property list. He handed me a printout already warm from the machine. "Do you want to ride to headquarters?" he asked. "I will follow," I said, checking the time. Jules stepped out behind me with eyes swollen and clear. She lifted her phone and showed a new message bubble. The sender name was a third contact I did not expect. "Another person," she whispered, voice shaking again. "Backup plan," the detective murmured, reading over her shoulder. He pointed to a marked line on the street. "Stay visible and keep your screen up." We formed a triangle that blocked any path to run. A rideshare turned the corner and slowed near the curb. The driver looked toward the storefront and tapped the wheel. A familiar silhouette leaned in the back seat and waited. I felt rage slide into purpose like a blade into a sheath. "Round 2, I said, and the detective nodded once. The sedan with the cuffed woman pulled away toward the station. Dan stared after it like the world was leaving him behind. He reached for me and stopped with his hand in the air. "Come with me," he tried, voice raw and breaking. "I am going," I answered, "just not where you want." The rideshare door opened and the new figure stepped out. He scanned the faces and tucked his chin into his collar. The detective moved first and showed his badge. Jules looked at me like she wanted to scream. I kept my eyes on the newcomer and braced for the reveal. "You requested this ride?" the detective asked, tone careful. The man nodded once and checked the street again. "Purpose of your visit?" the detective continued, pen hovering. The man's mouth twisted as he weighed a lie against the scene. He chose wrong, and the driver leaned forward in alarm. The detective lifted a hand and 2 uniforms materialized. They angled the man toward the wall with practiced ease. A small packet fell from his sleeve and hit the sidewalk. Jules made a small sound and covered her face. The detective looked at me and then at Dan. "Thank you for moving early," he said, crisp and final. "Without that message, we might have missed him." I breathed once and counted to 3 out loud. The second suspect stared at the packet like it might vanish. Nothing vanished now, not with every eye on the ground. Dan closed his eyes and pressed fingers to his temples. Tell me this is not real, he whispered at the sky. Traffic rolled by and ignored our small disaster. I put the still frames back into my bag and zipped it shut. It was real, and the next call would make it permanent. The detective gestured toward his car and opened the rear door. Statements, then a protective order if you want one. I looked at Jules and then back to the building. Protective order, I said, and the words steadied me. We stepped off the curb together while Dan watched me leave. I signed the statement and slid the pen back. Protective order, I repeated, and the detective nodded once. He radioed the request while I pressed both palms flat. My hands finally steadied, which scared me more. I was becoming someone who moved on impact. They photographed the second packet on the curb. A field test turned purple, then darker, and stopped arguments. The driver gave his name and shook with contained panic. The new suspect stared at the pavement like it might open. No one looked at me until I cleared my throat. Headquarters, the detective said, opening the rear door for us. Jules hovered, then climbed in and hugged her elbows. I sat opposite and braced my feet against the floor. Dan remained on the sidewalk with his phone lowered. He didn't follow, and that told me plenty. At intake, they separated us and took our phones. A recorder clicked and a clock began to matter. Walk me through the morning from 8, the interviewer started. I traced each choice like stepping stones over water. His pen never stopped while I refused to look away. Why do you believe the kitchen was targeted? He asked. Because someone hovered and timed my lunch exactly. I gave him the stills, the clips, the timestamps. He reviewed each page and placed sticky flags at edges. Your detail helps, he said, and my lungs unlocked. He led me to a smaller room for the order. A magistrate appeared on a screen with brisk courtesy. The detective summarized threat, exposure, and the arrest earlier. Immediate order granted, the magistrate stated without hesitation. Issue service within the hour, and the screen went dark. I exhaled once and text vibrated through the desk. Temporary order pinged onto my phone with a docket number. I read it twice to keep from shaking. Boundaries now had teeth and my fear adjusted. I asked for copies for work and home deliveries. They moved me to a conference space for follow-up. Jules entered with red eyes and a clear spine. She set a second phone on the table and waited. That's the device used for messages with the other contact. The detective looked at her, then at me, then nodded. Unlock it, he requested, and she obeyed fast. A thread opened with calls and pictures of small vials. Dates matched the last 2 weeks with chilling neatness. He captured each image and logged them to evidence. Jules clasped her hands and stared at a scuffed tile. You will need counsel, he advised, measured and direct. I will cooperate, she answered, voice steady for once. The room felt colder as reality settled into place. I watched her breathe and hated her and needed her. Truth sometimes arrives holding both knives and bandages. The door opened and Dan stepped in with permission. He stopped when he saw the recorder on the table. Can we talk alone? He asked, rubbing his temples. No, I said, and the detective didn't move. This conversation belonged in the light, not shadows. Dan pulled a chair and sat without touching the table. She is still my mother, he started, tone cracked and low. And she is in custody because of evidence, I answered. His eyes closed as if that could turn the page. It will destroy everything we know, he breathed, not looking up. Everything we knew already ended, I told him calmly. We lost our child and I almost died. He flinched, then stared at my hands like they accused him. I loved that baby, he said, voice rough with sand. I also loved the woman you refused to see clearly. He looked toward the detective as if for rescue. None came and the room hummed like a held breath. I need you to tell the truth in writing, I said. About calls, visits, anything before the hospital. His mouth opened and closed and memory fought loyalty. The detective slid a voluntary statement form across. A pen followed with a soft click that felt loud. Dan took it, hesitated, then began to write slowly. He listed times that matched my screenshots exactly. He handed the paper back with his shoulders slumped. Thank you, I said, because gratitude had leverage. He looked up and some old version of us flickered. I do not know how to forgive, he whispered. You do not have to, I kept my voice even. You just have to stop helping the lie. The detective re-entered with a prosecutor on a call. Arraignment this afternoon, came through the speaker plainly. Bail arguments will involve danger to a witness. I knew who the witness was and felt my pulse race. Being necessary didn't feel like safety, it felt like bait. We can transport you by a separate route, the detective offered. Use it, I answered, and Jules nodded mutely beside me. Victim's advocate will meet you at the courthouse, he added. I squeezed my fingers into fists and then released. Every step was a decision to keep walking. We exited through a secured door and into a stairwell. I counted flights to keep my thoughts from spiraling. A car waited with tinted glass and a driver focused. I climbed in and stared at my reflection until it blurred. Jules sat forward and didn't speak. Silence worked harder. At the courthouse, a woman in a blazer met us. Here is what will happen in order, she said gently. Entry, hearing, conditions, release or remand. She handed me a printed card with her direct number. I placed it in my pocket and anchored to its weight. Inside the gallery, I took a bench near the aisle. A deputy asked for my phone and I passed it over. Across the room, the new suspect sat with clenched jaw. He scanned faces and landed on mine with blame. I held his stare until he dropped it like a stone. The judge entered and the room shifted into obedience. Dockets read, cases called, motions clipped and precise. Our case came fast and without ceremony. The prosecutor laid out the timeline in 10 clean points. Footage, vials, 2 devices, a contaminated meal that killed. Defense argued community ties and a misunderstanding. They leaned on character letters I did not read. The prosecutor responded with the order and the lab report. Risk to the petitioner remains substantial, she stated flat. I felt the floor TD, and then the judge ruled. Remand pending hearing came like a gavel in my chest. The Bengal woman did not look at me while they turned her. Her jaw flexed once and then went still. I inhaled and tasted metal that wasn't there. Pain returned like a memory, and I let it pass. The second suspect requested supervised release and lost. They led him away without touching his gaze. My stomach unclenched one notch that barely counted. The advocate tapped my shoulder and nodded toward the corridor. We keep moving, she whispered, and I followed her out. Outside the courtroom, Dan waited with a white face. He reached for my sleeve and stopped when I stiffened. I will get a lawyer for you, he offered helplessly. I already have one from the state, I answered. Use your money wherever your conscience points, I added. He winced like I had struck him with a phrase. Do you want me home tonight? He asked faintly. Not yet, I said, and his shoulders sank completely. This is the condition, I continued, holding up the order. You accept it or you sleep elsewhere for now. He nodded without meeting my eyes and stepped back. My phone buzzed with a text from the investigator. Search warrants executed at residence and office. My pulse quickened and steadied in the same breath. Return here for a brief debrief, the next line read. We took the elevator down and crossed to the annex. The investigator waited with 2 folders and a tired smile. He opened the first and showed me printed messages. Another thread from the hidden phone, he explained. The sender offered money and used my due date as leverage. A photo followed of a calendar with a circled week. My ribs tightened as if expecting a blow that never landed. That was the plan, he said softly, eyes on me now. To time it when you were alone and hungry. I nodded once because anything more might break me. He opened the second folder with a different tone. Security pulled a deleted clip from the hallway cam. A partial figure appeared handing off a small pouch. The wrist cuff matched the bangle, but the hand was new. Third participant, he said, and my jaw set hard. Do you recognize the ring? He asked and zoomed in. I did, and my throat closed for a second. It belonged to a friend I had trusted with spare keys. The room tilted, then snapped back into alignment. Trust had been a net with knives baked into it. We are moving on him tonight, the investigator stated. Do you want notification when he's in custody? Yes, I answered, and the advocate squeezed my shoulder once. My chest filled with heat that wasn't rage exactly. It was resolve, growing muscles I didn't know I owned. We left the annex into late afternoon foot traffic. I walked with purpose that made strangers part without knowing. The advocate matched my steps and kept her voice low. You will get calls that make you doubt the order. Answer none of them alone, she warned, and I agreed. I called my workplace from the curb and asked for HR. Provide the holding notice and tell staff to preserve everything. They promised compliance and CC'd legal before I could blink. I thanked them and asked for a temporary leave. Approved came back fast and a weight slid off my spine. On the ride home, I drafted one last message to Dan. Pick up your things after 9 with a friend. Text before you arrive, I added and hit send. My hands shook afterward and then went quiet. Setting boundaries shook me more than walking into raids. At the house, I opened drawers and packed with method. Not a purge, not revenge, just distance and air. I moved pictures into a box and taped it shut. I placed the folder of stills on the highest shelf. I sat on the floor and let my body start to ache. A knock startled me and I walked to the peephole. The advocate stood there with a small bag and a smile. I brought door alarms and a camera for tonight. We installed them together with steady, efficient motions. The house learned new rules while my heart learned patience. After she left, I brewed tea and stared at the sink. Steam rose and faded and came back again. I thought of a tiny heartbeat that never returned. I pressed my hand to my abdomen and breath slow. Grief sat beside me, but it did not steer. My phone lit with a number from the investigator. Third arrest completed, he said, voice firm and brief. Evidence consistent, no contact permitted from any party. I thanked him and ended the call before tears started. I had asked for justice, it had started answering. At 9, a car idled at the curb, then turned off. A trunk opened and closed and footsteps approached the door. A single knock, then a pause like a prayer. I am here for my things, came through the wood. I opened with the chain still on and held his gaze. I will make copies of keys tomorrow, I said. He nodded and kept his hands where I could see. I will stay with a friend for now. Good, I answered, because approval cost me nothing. He lifted a box and stared at the threshold like a cliff. I did not know, he whispered, eyes wet and unfocused. I know, I answered, and that truth hurt worse. Knowing now is the only thing that counts. He blinked hard and carried the box down the steps. His shoulders curved like a question he couldn't solve. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slow. The alarm chirped once and settled into watch. I walked to the bedroom and folded the blanket back. The silence felt earned instead of empty for the first time. I lay down with my phone face up and ready. Before sleep took me, a final message arrived. Preliminary charges filed, the prosecutor wrote in plain text. Your presence requested at the next hearing, followed below. I turned the phone over and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow I would stand again and keep standing. I did not forgive anyone in that moment. I did not absolve the man who couldn't look straight. I did not cure the piece of me that kept counting weeks. I just chose to believe myself without asking permission. That choice clicked into place like a lock engaging. The next morning I woke before dawn and sat upright. I packed a small bag and pressed my palm to it. I opened the door and stepped into a colder street. My breath drew lines that vanished and reappeared with each step. I walked toward a day that would not break me again.